2, 1. The Committee on Border Security, Facilitation, and Operations will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Thank you for joining today's hearing to examine the Department of Homeland Security's efforts to combat the opioid epidemic. The past few years have weighed heavily on the American people. A once-in-a-lifetime virus and the resulting economic slowdown exacerbated existing public health crises, including our nation's struggle with drug addiction and overdose deaths. In fact, data from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention suggests that drug overdoses have increased sharply since the pandemic began. They believe more than 107,000 overdose deaths occurred in 2021, breaking all previous yearly records. The opioid crisis in the United States claims more lives each year than firearms, suicide, homicide, or motor vehicle crashes. Tackling the drug crisis is one of our most pressing national security, law enforcement, and public health challenges. We must do more to protect American lives. Now, I'm grateful to see this administration tackling the challenge head-on. Last month, President Biden released a new national drug control strategy focused on the actions needed to reduce overdoses and save lives. Those actions include disrupting and dismantling drug trafficking operations in which our witnesses here today play a key role. As we are all aware, the rise in the misuse of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids has its origins in the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's approval of the prescription opioid painkiller OxyContin in 1995, when it was falsely marketed as a non-addictive pain management medication. With the increased prescription, opioid dependence and addiction became an increased demand for synthetic opioids, which have transnational criminal organizations have exploited. Almost all of the synthetic opioids harming Americans are manufactured outside of the United States. The smuggling of these drugs into our country is an issue the Biden administration and Democrats are focused on tackling. In the past, Chinese fentanyl was frequently shipped directly to the United States in small, high-purity quantities. It was also shipped to Mexico and then smuggled across the border. However, as China took steps to police fentanyl and related drugs, production and distribution has increasingly shifted to Mexico. It has never been more important to enhance cooperation with Mexican authorities and disrupt the movement of hard drugs like heroin and fentanyl across the border. This is exactly what the Biden administration is doing. This administration also understands the overwhelming majority of hard drugs, more than 90%, are smuggled through legal ports of entry by documented travelers, not in between them. If you look up on the screen, you'll see a pie chart that uses CBP data to illustrate this. And that big blue section of the pie chart shows 91.3% coming in through ports of entry. Rather than waste resources building a wall or tearing families apart, the Biden administration has directed resources to ports of entry to interdict opioid shipments where they are arriving. They have also focused attention on disrupting and dismantling the transnational criminal organizations that smuggle these drugs into our communities. Despite the talking points I expect we will hear today from some of my colleagues, I'd like to be clear that migrants seeking asylum are not responsible for the vast majority of drugs arriving in our communities. According to CBP data, there is no correlation between the volume of hard drugs being seized at the border and the number of migrants encountered. For example, we saw seizures of fentanyl and heroin reach current levels in June of 2020. At the time, migration was still unnaturally suppressed by the border closures throughout Central America. Now, high levels of opioids and other illicit drugs are seized at points of entry during times of both high and relatively low migration. The Department of Homeland Security is in a unique position to respond to this crisis, both with its investigative arm and through our personnel and technologies stationed at the border, including the non-intrusive inspection systems and radiation technology to scan travelers, vehicles, and cargo entering the United States for narcotics. This technology is critical, and I support the department's goal of achieving a 100% scan rate. However, much more work needs to be done. Currently, less than 2% of private vehicles and 15% of commercial vehicles are screened for narcotics at the southwest border. Today, I look forward to hearing more about CBP's use of technology in K-9 units to detect opioids at our ports of entry. I also look forward to hearing more about HSI's efforts to investigate transnational criminal organizations and their drug supply chains to intercept drug shipments heading to the United States. Combating illicit drugs is no easy task, and enforcement alone will not solve the challenge. Tackling the opioid epidemic in our country requires a whole-of-society approach that goes beyond the scope of border enforcement. Nonetheless, the Department of Homeland Security has an important role in this fight. We must identify and resolve vulnerabilities, especially as traffickers continue to adapt their methods. Today's hearing will provide us with an opportunity to learn more about the department's efforts and challenges in combating the opioid epidemic. I look forward to a frank conversation on the current situation and our witnesses' recommendations for how Congress can take action to further protect our communities. And with that, the chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Higgins of Louisiana, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate the law enforcement professionals that are here with us today. I'd like to communicate clearly to Americans that are joining us today through this televised hearing, address the elders of the communities across America. Let me clarify a few things so you can grasp what we're dealing with in the country right now. The United States is currently undergoing a horrific drug epidemic crisis. Fentanyl, the synthetic opioid, is 80 to 100 times stronger than morphine. According to the DEA, our own Drug Enforcement Administration, just 2 milligrams of fentanyl can kill a person by ingestion, inhalation, or even absorption through the skin. Fentanyl is now the leading cause of death of Americans 18 to 45 years old. The Customs and Border Patrol have seized enough fentanyl just last year to kill 2.4 billion people. That's over 7 times the population of the United States of America. I hope America is paying attention to what I'm sharing here today. It should come as no shock, a reasonable assessment of what's happening at our southern border. Every American would look at that. Record numbers of illegal crossings driven by cartels that make their monies from trafficking drugs and human beings. It's a reasonable and pretty easy connection to make to understand that illegal crossings at the border that's out of control by any measure is directly related to the opioid crisis that we're suffering as a nation right now and the deaths that we're experiencing. 107,000 Americans died from opioid overdose last year. We've never seen numbers like this before. No matter where you are in law enforcement, this is touching your community. If you're an elder of your community, youngsters from your area that you love and care for, they've suffered loss, deaths. These kids are taking pills that are pressed by dealers with equipment they're buying online or building themselves to make pill presses out of raw materials that they're getting from somewhere, and it might be a clue where they're getting it from if you look at our southern border. This is just reality. And my colleagues like to use percentages across the aisle. They have graphs like this. They're entertaining, but no more, because they talk about percentages of seizures. And obviously, at our ports of entry, of large ships or trucks, professional law enforcement intercepts large shipments and quantities of drugs based upon investigative work and data from confidential informants. You don't stumble across a large shipment of drugs on the highway, in the belly of a ship, or hidden in the cargo of a truck. You don't stumble across that stuff. You're watching for that vessel. You're watching for that vehicle. You intercept it when it comes into your jurisdictional authority. And if your confidential informant was right, you have a big drug seizure. You law enforcement guys know that what I'm saying is true. So, of course, you can intercept a large volume and quantity of drugs in the holds of a ship as compared to on a backpack carried across the border. My colleagues like to say that migrants seeking asylum are not impacting this drug crisis. That's intellectually unsound and even disingenuous, because the young men that are crossing our border, I think we're pushing 1 million last year and this year. The official number is about 400,000 last year, unknown this year. They're called gotaways because they got away. They're not seeking asylum. Seeking asylum requires interaction with law enforcement professionals at the border to begin your process of asylum. You don't do that with a backpack of drugs. I'm asking America to be genuine about this conversation. On my side of the aisle, we want to have this conversation so that we can give the law enforcement professionals the assets and the assistance they need to do their job and restore American sovereignty at our southern border and save America from death by overdose that we're experiencing right now. But we cannot allow ourselves to be pulled into this false narrative of that. Don't pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Nothing here to see. Move along. He had 2.4 million illegal crossings last year, 500,000 gotaways. He's a stout young man, and a lot of them are carrying backpacks with drugs in them. And it does not take a lot of fentanyl to produce thousands and thousands and thousands of pills that are pressed to look like Xanax and Lortab and OxyContin, and they're sold on the streets for $5, $10, $15, $25 a pop at parties where your teenagers are going. And they're buying these pills and they're dying. So I encourage all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to engage honestly about what's happening in America today. I very much look forward to hearing from our law enforcement professionals today. Madam Chair, I yield.
I want to thank the ranking member. Members are reminded that the subcommittee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and the ranking member in their February 3, 2021 colloquy. Without objection, members not on the subcommittee shall be permitted to sit and question the witnesses. Not seeing the chairman of the full committee, we'll move on. Don't see the ranking member of the full committee. Now I would like to welcome our panel of witnesses. Mr. Brian Solk is the Executive Director of the Transnational Organized Crime Mission Center at DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis. Mr. Pete Flores is the Executive Assistant Commissioner of CBP's Office of Field Operations. Mr. Steve Kagan is the Assistant Director for Countering Transnational Organized Crime at ICE Homeland Security Investigations. Without objections, the witnesses' full statements will be inserted into the record. I will now ask each witness to summarize his statement for 5 minutes, beginning with Mr. Solk.
Chairwoman Badigan, Ranking Member Higgins, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Border Security Facilitation and Operations. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the growing opioid epidemic from the perspective of DHS's Office of Intelligence and Analysis. I'm honored to represent the dedicated intelligence professionals at INA who work to keep the homeland safe, secure, and resilient. First, I'd like to provide contextual information of the illicit fentanyl supply chain. It's cheaper, faster, and more resilient than plant-based illicit drugs such as heroin. Mexico-based drug trafficking organizations mainly the Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels, are leading manufacturers and smugglers of fentanyl to the U.S. These cartels import precursor chemicals into Mexico, mostly from China, and to a lesser extent, India. Suppliers adapt to enforcement pressure or legal restrictions by adjusting advertising or changing chemical structures that fall outside of existing drug controls. Dual-use chemicals used in synthetic drugs also present additional precursor detection challenges, as many have a legitimate use. After obtaining precursors, fentanyl production involves 3 stages: laboratory synthesis, pill pressing operations, and staging for cross-border smuggling. Once fentanyl is synthesized, a single pill pressing operation in Mexico can produce up to 150,000 tablets a day. Pills are then staged in stash houses along Mexico's northern border. Mexico-based drug traffickers primarily use personally owned and commercial vehicles to smuggle fentanyl into the U.S. through land border ports of entry. CBP will later address this in more detail. Once in the country, the DTOs or the affiliates distribute synthetic drugs to large distribution hubs such as Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, and New York. Fentanyl networks are among the world's first digital native drug networks. Direct-to-consumer transactions use social media to expand upon the more traditional distribution onward to local hubs. This e-commerce model also enables illicit actors to react rapidly to enforcement detection and reach an even broader customer base. We see fentanyl in 2 predominant forms: fake prescription pills and laced into hard drugs. Drug traffickers disguise fentanyl pills to look like prescription drugs, such as the commonly known Oxycontin, Percocet, Vicodin, Xanax, or stimulants like Adderall. The adulteration of fentanyl into hard drugs such as heroin and cocaine continue to be a rising concern as well. Illicit actors are likely adulterating these drugs to increase their potency and addictive properties to grow market demand. Since 2018, synthetic drugs such as fentanyl are the leading drivers of most drug-induced overdose deaths reported in the U.S. Provisional data from CDC's National Center for Health Statistics predicted almost 107,000 overall drug overdose deaths in the U.S. for 12 months ending in November 2021, and they appear to have hit the mark. Synthetic drugs attributed to 75% of those overdose deaths. With this understanding of the illicit fentanyl landscape, what are we doing about it? Our primary emphasis is collaboration. As an intelligence agency, INA is working with the DHS intelligence enterprise and the intelligence community to collect, research, and analyze information on transnational criminal organizations. Our assessments inform decision-making and operational planning across DHS, federal agencies, and state, local, tribal, and territorial partners to combat transnational criminal organizations. The INA Transnational Organized Crime Mission Center produces intelligence for maximum utility across law enforcement and at all levels and the intelligence community. In terms of fentanyl specifically, INA remains forward-leaning by challenging our historical understanding of drug flow. We strive to embrace alternative analysis because fentanyl is like any other traditional drug threat. We assess transnational organized criminal activity holistically to include other associated crimes and to seek, deter, disrupt, and dismantle the networks responsible for this opioid epidemic. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss this critical threat. We remain committed to keep the homeland safe, secure, resilient by safeguarding the nation from terrorist, criminal, and other threat actors.
Thank you, Mr. Salk, for your testimony. I now recognize Mr. Flores to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Barragan, Ranking Member Higgins, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear here today to discuss U.S. Customs and Border Protection's efforts to combat the illicit flow of drugs into the United States. CBP held its annual Valor Memorial last week. This year, 37 names are added to that monument. The names of 37 CBP officers and agents who gave their lives carrying out CBP's important mission. I'm proud to represent the brave women and brave and dedicated men and women of CBP who work tirelessly every day in often dangerous and difficult conditions to protect our border, our homeland, and our community. Today, I'd like to first highlight CBP seizures and trends in the border environment and then discuss CBP's multi-layered enforcement approach to countering the drug threat. As you're aware, the reach and influence of transnational criminal organizations, or TCOs, continues to expand across our borders. TCOs increasingly demonstrate the ability to manufacture sophisticated synthetic opioids and analogs that are difficult to detect and identify. They also continuously adjust operations, including shifting to drugs like synthetic opioids that can be concealed and transported in smaller quantities to circumvent detection, interdiction by law enforcement. In FY21, CBP seized more than 450 tons of illegal drugs, the majority being marijuana, but also cocaine, fentanyl, and methamphetamine. Nationwide, CBP seizures of fentanyl have increased sharply. In FY21, CBP seized more than 11,000 pounds of fentanyl, more than double the weight seized in FY20, and about 4 times as much as in FY19. Most illicit drugs, including fentanyl, enter the United States through the southwest border ports of entry. They are brought in by privately owned vehicles, commercial vehicles, and even pedestrians. Although much less frequent now, fentanyl and other synthetic opioids are also encountered in the international mail and express consignment carrier shipments. Most illicit fentanyl is synthesized in Mexico. We use an aggressive strategic enforcement approach that leverages advanced information, analytics, and intelligence, sophisticated detection, and scientific laboratory capabilities, and strong partnership to combat the cross-border flow of drugs. CBP's National Targeting Center, or NTC, uses advanced data along with law enforcement and intelligence records to identify suspect high-risk shipments, cargo, and travelers before they reach our borders. NTC also uses predictive analysis, focused on providing timely and actionable information to our partners and our frontline officers and agents. In the international mail and express consignment environments, CBP obtains electronic shipping information, providing valuable insight into inbound parcels. All CBP operation environments have sophisticated detection technology, including non-intrusive inspection systems, commonly called NII, that reliably and quickly detect the presence of suspect illegal narcotics within shipments, passenger belongings, cargo containers, commercial trucks, rail cars, and privately owned vehicles. Canine operations also provide invaluable detection capabilities. The CBP Canine Training Program maintains the largest and most diverse law enforcement canine training program in the country. Furthermore, all Office of Field Operations concealed human and narcotic canine teams have completed training to include the odor of fentanyl and fentanyl analogs. CBP's enforcement approach not only focuses on efficient detection of suspected illicit drugs, but also prioritizes swift identification of substances. In the field, CBP officers use various field testing devices to rapidly screen suspected controlled substances. On-site CBP laboratories and scientists, as well as a 24/7 forensic reachback center, enable CBP officers to submit data electronically to CBP scientists for identification. All CBP seizure information and laboratory identification data are provided to NTC and our federal investigative partners. It is a collaborative approach that leads to investigations, prosecutions, and dismantling of TCO networks and operations. Our partners are critical. We work closely with our federal partners as well as state, local, tribal, international partners to share information, collaborate in joint enforcement operations to identify, target, and disrupt illicit and drug activity. As the threat of illicit drug persists in our communities across the United States, CBP will continue to prioritize and dedicate resources to counter TCOs, disrupt the flow of illicit drugs across our borders. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Flores. I now recognize Mr. Kagan to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Barragan, Ranking Member Higgins, and distinguished members of the House Subcommittee on Border Security, Facilitation, and Operations. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you and discuss Homeland Security investigations efforts to combat opioid smuggling. As the principal investigative component of the Department of Homeland Security, HSI is responsible for investigating and dismantling transnational criminal organizations, flooding the United States with drugs, fueling the overdose epidemic. To do this, HSI conducts federal criminal investigations at every critical location in the illicit supply chain. Internationally, where TCOs operate and manufacture illegal drugs. At our nation's physical borders, where smugglers attempt to exploit America's legitimate trade, travel, and finance. In our communities, where criminal organizations earn substantial profits from selling poison to our friends, neighbors, and family members. HSI's counter-drug efforts begin abroad. HSI has the largest international investigative presence within DHS, comprised of hundreds of special agents strategically assigned to 86 offices in 54 countries. This includes offices located in Mexico, where the vast majority of fentanyl is produced, and throughout the Asia-Pacific region, where precursor chemicals originate. The effectiveness of our international counter-narcotics efforts is greatly enhanced by HSI's Transnational Criminal Investigative Units, or TCIUs. TCIUs are composed of foreign, vetted law enforcement officials and prosecutors who lead some of HSI's most significant extraterritorial investigations and prosecutions targeting TCOs. HSI has established 12 TCOs around the world. Disrupting and dismantling the fentanyl and methamphetamine precursor chemical supply chain is an integral element to HSI's approach to stopping the flow of illicit drugs. These precursors serve as oxygen the cartels need to manufacture their poison destined for America's cities and streets. To date, HSI's efforts have resulted in the seizure of 633,000 kilograms of precursor chemicals destined for Mexican cartels. Many of these enforcement efforts are led by HSI's TCIU in Mexico, where in addition to seizing precursor chemical shipments, they also lead investigations targeting the labs where the chemicals are synthesized into illegal drugs. Mexican cartels operate on an industrial scale when procuring precursor chemicals from abroad. The interdiction of these shipments has a profound effect on the volume of drugs reaching our country. A seizure of a single kilogram of fentanyl precursor can prevent the production of almost 20 kilograms of processed fentanyl. A perfect example of HSI's efforts is a seizure in March 2021 of 750 kilograms of a fentanyl precursor on its way to Mexico. If that precursor had reached the hands of a Mexican cartel, it would have produced 7.4 billion doses of fentanyl, destined for the hands of Americans. HSI's efforts to combat synthetic drugs continue at the border, where HSI is responsible for responding to all CBP interdictions to start or continue an investigation. HSI investigations remain one of the best tools for degrading TCO capabilities and stemming the flow of illicit opioids into the United States. HSI's Border Enforcement Security Task Forces, or BEST task forces, represent one of the agency's premier tool for turning simple border seizures into TCO toppling investigations. The primary mission of the BESTs is to combat TCOs by employing a full range of state, local, federal, tribal, and international law enforcement resources. There are currently 82 BESTs comprising more than 2,000 law enforcement officers and personnel representing 200 agencies. In addition to the BESTs, each of HSI's 253 offices in all 50 states and multiple U.S. territories dedicate assets to combat the flow of illicit drugs. The illicit drug supply chain, fueling the overdose deaths throughout the country, begins abroad and ends on Main Street. HSI, along with our partners, is dedicated to using its broad and unique authorities to stop illicit drugs at every critical location within the supply chain. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you and for your continued support of HSI and the critical role it plays in attacking the illicit drug supply chain. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. I thank all of the witnesses for their testimony, and I remind the subcommittee that we will each have 5 minutes to question the panel. I now recognize myself for questions. I am honored to have the opportunity to ask these questions because this is something that's been of concern, and more specifically, we're talking about persons bringing in drugs via the actual ports of entry juxtaposed to the landmass within ports, between ports of entry. The indication is that approximately 194,000 pounds of fentanyl, methamphetamine, and heroin came in between ports of entry. Mr. Flores, is this a fairly accurate assessment?
Congressman, thank you for the question. In regards to
Mr.
narcotics,
Flores, let me do this. Because I have to lay a predicate, I'm going to ask you to give me as close as you can to a yes or a no.
as far as the narcotics coming in between the ports of entry, I'm not sure on that exact number. What I do know, being responsible for our ports of entry, that we see the high percentage of narcotics that we intercept at our ports of entry.
All right. Assuming that we have this high number, 194,000 pounds, I respect those who believe that most of it comes in between ports of entry. So let's examine the numbers. Let's just look at the numbers. If you assume that just this amount comes in between ports of entry, it would take 194,000 people bringing it in if each carried 1,000 pounds. Since we know that most people can't carry 1,000 pounds, let's assume that each person carries 500 pounds. It would take 388,000 people coming in between ports of entry, carrying 500 pounds. Good number of people can't carry 500 pounds. Let's assume that it's 250 pounds that each person has. That would take 776,000 people. Probably 125 pounds may be about what some people can carry. It would take 1,552,000 people bringing it in between ports of entry. It just seems to me that we can accept the premise, or I accept it, that this is coming in primarily through ports of entry. Is there someone on the panel who agrees with this assessment that this is coming in primarily through ports of entry?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Again, what we see coming through the ports of entry is what we know in regards to volume and seizures, whether that's in a containerized, on a vessel on a containerized shipment, whether that's a tractor trailer, in a vehicle, or on a pedestrian coming in through our
Mr.
ports of
Flores, let
entry.
me ask you this. Do you believe that we've had 1,552,000 people bringing in 125 pounds in backpacks in 1 year? That's what the statistical information indicates.
Congressman, what I do know is that the methods used to smuggle narcotics across our borders varies in different ways, and whether that is by backpacks, whether that's by vehicles, whether that's by use of drones.
I believe that backpacks are used too, no disrespect. But do you think that 1,552,000 people are bringing it in on backpacks, or is most of it coming in through the ports of entry, sir?
Again, from my perspective, being in charge of the ports of entry, what we see is the seizure of narcotics mostly at our ports of entry.
Thank you. I thank you for that kind answer. Friends, this is a problem. Where it comes in, regardless as to where it comes in, is still a problem. I don't in any way want to minimize the fact that we've got a problem to deal with. But I do think that it's difficult to conceive of 1,552,000 people bringing this in, carrying it between ports of entry. That number just doesn't add up for me. And Madam Chair, to be kind to my colleagues who all have questions, I'll yield back my additional 13 seconds.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and I want to apologize. I am in a competing energy and commerce markup, which is why you see me running out because there's a roll call vote, and Mr. Green graciously agreeing to chair in my absence. And so I want to thank the witnesses, since I didn't have a chance to do that. The chair will now recognize other members for questions they may wish to ask the witnesses. As previously outlined, I will recognize members in order of seniority, alternating between the majority and the minority. Members are reminded to unmute themselves when recognized for questions. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Salk, your role with Office of Intelligence and Analysis perhaps best equips you to answer this. For our purposes here, I believe every law enforcement professional present has insight on this, but I'd like to ask you specifically regarding the percentages of content of fentanyl that we're seeing in final user pill product pressed into false prescription drugs primarily and sold in the streets of America, across America. My sources tell me that over the course of the last year, the amount of fentanyl that's pressed into the average pill has increased. And I'm advised that this because the fentanyl is so abundant, that it's so abundant by now, after almost 2 years of, a year and a half of heavy crossings at the border. The volume of fentanyl is so heavy in the garages of the drug dealers and the drug houses across the country that are processing this stuff and getting it out into the street in final user form. I'm told there's so much of it that they're just increasing the percentage of fentanyl to make their product a little more powerful, a little more addictive, as you stated in your opening testimony. To what extent are you saying that true from the intelligence and analysis perspective?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Higgins. We have seen over the last couple of years a slight increase in purity. Not a huge increase, but it has increased.
Could you clarify for America why a dealer would want to seek that sweet spot of balance? Because if he puts too much, what would happen?
It would increase deaths.
His customers
Overdose
die.
deaths.
Exactly. So dealers across the country, that's what I'm trying to share with America. These dealers have so much fentanyl, they're giving it away. They're pressing fentanyl into their final product that they're selling on the streets, and this stuff is coming across the board. As much as my colleagues, want to point to the ports of entry, may I say that's a criminal capture and good for law enforcement. But your ports of entry are reflective. Those seizures are reflective of investigations and confidential informants. These are larger shipments in vehicles and vessels, easier to identify and intercept from a law enforcement investigative perspective. But our frontline enforcement at the border, those men and women, they're quite capable of detecting and pursuing and apprehending, these stout young men crossing 5, 10, 15 at a time, wearing camouflage and carpet shoes, et cetera, covering their spores, and they have backpacks. They have camelbacks with water, and they're rolling in a manner we haven't seen before. They're certainly carrying drugs in their backpack, a lot of them. It doesn't take a lot of it in order to impact the opioid crisis in America. It's making its way into the streets. And you can't measure that because you're not catching those guys. Why? Because our agents are pulled into processing. Who are they processing? The citizens from other countries that are seeking asylum. But those citizens, those little family units and individuals are seeking a better life in America. God bless them. We wish they'd come here legally and properly. However, those guys, they're seeking interaction with law enforcement. They're not avoiding it. The ones crossing it between the ports of entry, carrying backpacks, are avoiding law enforcement. And there's so much fentanyl has made it to the street. Mrs. Salk, you're seeing a slight increase. Again, just clarify for America why a drug dealer would want to find that balance of just how powerful he can make his pills without putting too much fentanyl. Explain that to America, please.
Well, sir, in terms of the addictive properties, a seller would seek to increase the addictive properties to increase how addictive, if they're lacing heroin or cocaine, for instance, they would be seeking to make that more potent and more addictive. In terms of the false prescription drugs like Xanax and Adderall, et cetera, that one's a little hard, at least from my standpoint, and my colleagues may have better insight, but that one's harder to determine why they would be willing to have such a high death by overdose rate, simply because the way that's purchased, there's a good, most of the people who purchase it don't understand that fentanyl is lacing what they think is a legal prescription drug. And so they wouldn't be necessarily incentivized to continue getting it if they don't even know they're getting it. So that one's a little more difficult to understand, but in talking to our analysts, their belief is that what is happening with those prescription drugs that are being laced is that they are just looking to sell it as many ways as possible.
Mr.
That
Salk,
makes sense, Mr.
Salk,
Salk. In the interest of time, my time has expired. I thank you for your answer. It was squared away, sir. Madam Chair, I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I was trying to be gracious there, but we want to make sure our members get our questions in before votes. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. I want to put up a chart, if we may, showing the correlation, or I should say the lack of correlation between migration and opioid seizures. This is a graph we're happy to make available. The data was taken straight from Customs and Border Protection data, and it shows that line on the bottom that you see that's green is seizures happening between the ports of entry. And that blue line that you see, which is the big one at the top, is the seizures at the ports of entry and vehicle checkpoints. So you could see the huge disparity there. And then if you see the bars behind there, that shows encounters at the border. And so if you take a look at that chart, you will actually see that there is no correlation between migration and the opioid seizures. And I just want to remind folks that the chart that we put up at the beginning, the pie chart, is data directly from CBP showing that 91.3% of seizures are through the ports of entry. So staying on message on honesty and data, I think it's important that people see the visuals to see the truth. And gentlemen, I want to thank you for your efforts on what you do day in and day out to combat and do everything you can to keep drugs out of this country, and that's why we're having this hearing, is to hear from you on what Congress can do. Now, the opioid epidemic is a public health crisis, and I applaud CBP and the Department for seizing dangerous opioids before they reach our communities. Mr. Flores, if I may, what additional resources or technology would help CBP detect and interdict opioids at the border?
Chairwoman, thank you for the question. You know, our employees are our most vital resources. And as even despite a global pandemic, what we were able to do is really dedicate ourselves to ensure staffing levels at our ports of entry were maintained at our appropriated staffing levels there. We're able to bring on officers and ag specialists to ports of entry that we needed them. So I would like to thank you for the congressional support given to us despite a decline in collections during the pandemic, that we were able to maintain our staffing levels. It has positioned us, put us in a better position to respond to the increasing volume of traffic that we see coming back as we get to pre-pandemic levels of trade and travel coming across our borders. Infrastructure is also an important factor for us on aging ports of entry and what our capabilities and what infrastructure is for us. So again, the bipartisan infrastructure law that was just passed, the $3.4 billion to GSA and the money to CBP, an important aspect of how we vitalize ports of entry and really provide the needed space for efficient and effective screening, inspections, targeting of illicit drugs coming across our border there. I would say lastly, technology for us in regards to what we're doing in regards to non-intrusive technology, what we can do, drive-through systems, looking at pre-primary systems where we will get more efficient rates and scannings of people and things coming across our border in order to help us make a better assessment of narcotics coming in.
Thank you, Mr. Flores. Mr. Kagan and Mr. Salk, the next question's for you. What I have heard is that the majority of drugs are seized at the ports of entry. Generally, that's coming from documented travelers. Do either of you expect the terminating Title 42 would result in a significant increase in the amount of drugs being smuggled into our communities? Mr. Salk?
Thank you, Chairwoman. We believe that we would continue to see the same scheme that we have seen in the past. We've seen some instances, perhaps, of migrants and drugs as a mixed event, but they're still rare. DTOs and human smuggling organizations are opportunistic and transactional with their operations, and they're strongly motivated by profits. So combined drugs and migrant smuggling events are not really a routine practice at all. The illicit actors facilitating these movements are likely to keep these entities separate to minimize the risk of losing the potential revenue for the much higher value drugs such as fentanyl.
Thank you, Mr. Kagan. In 20 seconds, if you might be able to answer.
I'll be quick so I don't get the gavel. At HSI, we see the same thing. When we're looking at the entire transnational criminal organization and looking at the key network spots within the supply chain, we see that drugs and human smuggling are separate. They might use the same routes, but we predominantly see the drugs coming in through the ports of entry, just like CBP mentioned.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. My time has expired. I will yield back. I now will recognize the representative guest. You are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Flores, first want to thank you and the men and women of CBP for your service, for all that you do each and every day. In April, CBP reported 234,088 immigrants encountered along our border, the largest number ever recorded. The month that this administration took office in January of last year, that number was 78,414 immigrants. That's an increase of almost 300% in just 15 months. Total encounters under this administration, taking numbers since February of 2021, are 2,735,000 encounters, a number greater than the population of 13 states, a number greater than the population of Vermont, Alaska, North and South Dakota, Delaware, Rhode Island, Montana, Maine, New Hampshire, Hawaii, West Virginia, Idaho, Nebraska, and New Mexico. At the current rate, next month it will eclipse 3 additional states, including my home state of Mississippi. We know that narcotic seizures along the southwest border have continued to rise. You actually address that in page 2 of your testimony. You say there in page 2 that in fiscal year 2021, CBP seized 11,201 pounds of fentanyl, over twice the number seized in fiscal year 2020. You go on to say, since October 1st, 2021, CBP has seized 5,310 pounds of fentanyl. You go on to say that if you measure that by dosage units, that 2.6 billion with a B, potential doses of fentanyl were seized in fiscal year 2021, and that 17 billion with a B doses of methamphetamine were seized in 2021. And then to put that in perspective, you go on to say that the Earth's population is approximately 7.9 billion people. Secretary Mayorkas has been here to Congress before. He sat in the very seat where you sit today, and he's testified that the border is closed, that the border is secure, and that we have operational control of the border. And so my question to you, Mr. Flores, is that in light of these figures that I have just spoken, do you believe that our border is closed? And do you believe that our border is secure?
Congressman, thank you for the question. In regards to field operations at our ports of entry, our priorities are and continue to be our national and economic security priorities at our ports of entry along the entirety of the United States. And by doing that, we inspect, we facilitate, we target, we screen high-risk shipments and individuals coming into our ports of entry. We do that every day. Our men and women that are operating in our ports of entry can do that and do an excellent job at that every single day as they're dealing with legitimate trade and travel, looking for those individuals that are looking to do this country harm in the communities we live in. So we will continue to operate that as we have been in ensuring our national priorities are being taken care of as well as our economic priorities.
And Ms. Ford, I don't argue with you. I don't disagree with you. I would agree. I've been to the border on numerous occasions. I've met with officers of CBP. I've met with community leaders. They all tell me the same thing without exception, is they feel like that this administration has abandoned them. They've told us that this is the worst that they've ever seen the southwest border. And so my question to you is very simple. It is a yes or no answer. And I'm asking your personal opinion. I'm not asking the opinion of Secretary Mayorkas. I'm not asking the opinion of CBP. I'm asking your opinion. Do you believe that our border is secure, and do you believe that our border is closed?
Congressman, I would say ports of entry, the men and women from field operations at our ports of entry, and the entirety of CBP, we are doing the best job we can do given the current environment.
And I agree with you. You need more resources, you need more manpower, and I'm not arguing that, but I've got 10 seconds, and I would like an answer in that 10 seconds, either yes or no. Is the border closed, and is the border secure? Could you please answer that?
From a port of entry perspective, our borders have been open in regards to being able to process legitimate trade and travel coming across our ports of entry, as well as enforcing.
Are our borders secure?
From a port of entry perspective, we have officers, again, doing the best they can in securing this border every single day.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Representative Clyde, the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you. Our nation is currently facing a myriad of crises: record-breaking high inflation, runaway Washington spending, and an open southern border that is allowing an out-of-control number of illegal aliens and illegal and dangerous drugs flow into our borders. The CDC recently announced that more than 107,000 Americans died of drug overdoses last year. Of those deaths, nearly two-thirds of fatal overdoses were caused by fentanyl or another synthetic opioid. That is a 23% increase from 2020. Fentanyl, as Ranking Member Higgins has already noted, is now the leading cause of death of Americans from the ages of 18 to 45. And it may be as much fentanyl poisoning as anything else. That's an incredible statistic. That's a heartbreaking statistic. And that fentanyl is coming across our southern border. In my home state of Georgia, between 2012 and 2019, fentanyl overdoses claimed the lives of nearly 1,250 individuals. Last year alone, Customs and Border Protection in 8 ports of entry, just 8 alone, seized 588 pounds of fentanyl coming across the border. That's enough to kill over 133 million people, to kill all the residents of Georgia over 12 times over. So for each of you, Mr. Kagan, I'll start with you. Yes or no, do you believe border security is related directly to national security?
HSI is there to investigate south of the border.
Just yes or no would be fine, sir.
Say it again, repeat the question.
Do you believe that border security is related directly to national security?
It's one of the factors of national security. Sir.
Okay, all right. Between our ports of entry, do you think we have a secure border? Yes or no is fine.
HSI is not the one to answer the question as it pertains to
So you don't know.
the physical border.
So you don't know.
No, sir.
Okay, all right. Mr. Flores, I'm going to ask you the same thing. Do you believe that border security is related directly to national security?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I do believe they both are important and they are related, yes.
Okay, great. So between our ports of entry, do you believe we have a secure southern border?
I believe the men and women of the U.S. Border Patrol and CBP as a whole, collectively, we are doing our best.
I know you're doing the best job you
best we
can. That's not
with
my
what we
question.
have.
My question is, do we have a secure southern border between our ports of entry?
From a responsible for our United States ports of entry from a field operations perspective, from a U.S. Border Patrol perspective, probably better answered by them. But again, with the resources that the U.S. Border Patrol
all right.
has between the ports of entry.
Then, Mr. Sok, I'm going to ask you the same question. Do you believe that border security is related directly to national security?
Sir, yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. Do you believe we have a secure southern border between our ports of entry?
I do. I believe we have
Okay, thank you.
vulnerabilities.
All right, that's fine. All right, now, Mr. Flores, you testified that last year that 11,200 pounds of fentanyl was seized between both ports of entry and between ports of entry, correct? All right. Now, we had 400,000 gotaways, we think, that people that were not caught at the southern border that came into the United States, possibly as many as 800,000. And many of them were carrying backpacks. So what is the average amount of a fentanyl seizure? I mean, from 11,200 pounds on an annual basis, what's the average amount that border protection seizes?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Just average, you mean per seizure?
Per seizure, I'm sorry, yes, per seizure.
So that would vary depending on the type of, or the mode it was being transported or smuggled. That could be in a tractor trailer. It would be
I get that. What is the average amount per seizure that you normally, that you would see?
So we could see anywhere from a kilo to potentially 15 kilos.
Okay, 15 kilos, about 30 pounds, anywhere from a couple of pounds to 30 pounds, easily carried by an individual. All right. So do you know, is it different whether it's between a port of entry or between port of entries?
Typically, in between the ports of entry, the seizures that I'm aware of have been smaller amounts. If they're hidden in a conveyance, a commercial conveyance, or some type of passenger vehicle, those tend to be larger amounts.
Okay, then, and when you look at potentially 400,000 gotaways, and you're looking at maybe 2 pounds,
The gentleman's
That's
time
potentially-
has expired.
that's potentially a tremendous amount that we're not even seeing. So I don't think there's a correlation between what you get at a port of entry and what you get between ports of entry, because we don't have that information, and we can't
Gentleman,
really say
time
that.
has
Thank you, and
expired.
I yield.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair will now recognize Representative Bishop for North Carolina for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I'm sorry, I had another committee hearing, so I'm late, but I hope I can ask a question that's cogent, and it may well tread over ground that you all have well covered. I take it there's been a good discussion about the drugs coming in at the ports of entry and not between the ports of entry. So at risk, I'm sure, of recreating the wheel a little bit. Maybe somebody can help me understand. If we have, a lot of what we're talking about today is fentanyl which can kill in extraordinarily small amounts. So you don't have to have truckloads coming across in order to do immense damage. And so let me just ask the question of whoever on the panel is capable of helping orient me. Why isn't, if you have 700,000, 750,000 gotaways, why is there not immense risk of fentanyl entering the country via gotaways? Maybe Mr. Flores?
Sure. Congressman, thank you for the question. In regards to fentanyl coming into the country, at our ports of entry is where we see a significant volume of fentanyl as the approach is coming into our ports of entry.
So thank you for that. I think I got that even before I sat down, and even recited, I understood we'd trod that ground. The question I'm asking is another one, which is, that implies, because you say you believe it comes in through the ports of entry, it would imply that allowing 750,000 gotaways to come across the border without interdicting them is not really a risk for illicit drug purposes, because how could there be any harm? And what I'm asking you, am I wrong when I say my understanding is that very small amounts of fentanyl can kill hundreds of thousands of people? Why wouldn't the use of mules coming across at places other than points of entry and evading Border Patrol, so they're gotaways, and you know we've got lots of gotaways, why is that not a material risk of the entry of illegal drugs?
Congressman, thank you for the question. In regards to gotaways, those are unknowns. So in regards, I will not say there's no risk, because there's absolutely, with the unknown, there is risk there on what they could be introducing in the country. So it's just an unknown.
So I lately have been given the understanding that with respect to fentanyl, you can have like 4 grains out of a salt shaker and that can kill a person. Isn't that true? It's whether that's precisely the right number or not, it's small, minuscule amounts like that can cause death to a human. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Okay. And if you take like what might be in a sugar packet that you'd put in your coffee, that quantity can kill many humans, correct?
Depending on the purity of what that fentanyl makeup is, correct.
Okay.
Chemical composition.
Why isn't the introduction of fentanyl in substantial quantities into this country, why isn't that a terrorism risk? Isn't this a chemical weapon?
Congressman, thank you for the question. In regards to why isn't it a terrorist threat, I wouldn't be the correct person to answer that.
Is there somebody on this panel that could speak to why that's not considered terrorism? Let me ask this question, and I'll ask whoever's competent to say something about it. You've heard of anthrax and ricin, poisons that transmitted to Congress or something. You had that could kill tons of people. How is fentanyl less dangerous than anthrax or ricin? Does anybody know that it's less dangerous? Well, let me just say, in the 53 seconds I've got that remain, if I understand the thrust of this hearing is to suggest that the Biden administration's catastrophic relinquishment of control of the border is not jeopardizing America with a flood of drugs because drugs are interdicted at the points of entry and are not otherwise coming across, that is lunacy. When you have a huge numbers of gotaways because you've overloaded the process, there is very good prospect that you're going to see that large quantities of drugs come in, and I see no way it's different than a risk of a terrorist with another type of dangerous chemical. Mr. Higgins, I'm sorry I didn't save any time to yield to you, but I gave you whatever I got.
I thank the gentleman. Madam Chair, I'd like to submit for the record a media article, quoting the Secretary Mayorkas as saying, regarding the border, we're going to lose. It's unsustainable.
There's no objection. The article will be admitted. Thank you. And the gentleman's time has expired. I want to thank the witnesses, gentlemen, for your valuable testimony and the members for their questions. You know, I'd be interested in continuing the conversation with you and your teams as to how we can prevent these drugs from reaching American communities and focused on the solutions. And I want to thank you, Mr. Flores, for offering some of the things that Congress can do to be helpful. So I will reach out after this hearing to continue that conversation so we can get to solutions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing. The chair reminds members that the committee record remains open for 10 business days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.